I'm Jenny Peterson. I'm president of the Ronald County Genealogical Society, and we're thrilled to see so many of you here this afternoon. It's a beautiful day out there. You have lots of choices, but thanks for coming here to learn about the Indians. Our speaker today is Ronald D. Parks, who got his English degree here from Kansas State University and then spent most of his career at the Kansas State Historical Society in the Historic Sites Division. When he retired in 2004, he waited for his wife to retire by writing a book. And that book is the subject of our talk today, The Darkest Period. And it won both the 2014 Prairie Heritage Book Award for the best book about the heritage of the Great Plains, and the Santa Fe Trail Association's Lewis Berry Writing Award for the best book or major article about the Santa Fe Trail in 2014 also. So The Darkest Period was also listed by the Kansas Library Association as a Kansas Notable Book for 2015. So lots of nice awards when the book first came out, and he's still selling it and talking about it today. So we're pleased that he's willing to share his story with us here this afternoon. So Ron?
Well, good afternoon. Really pleased to be invited to talk about the darkest period, the history of the Kanza, with a group of people that I think this is a good indication that there's a genuine interest in the Kanza in this community, which there should be, given that the Blue Earth Village was inhabited here near Manhattan from 1795 to 1829. Manhattan over the last 10-15 years has laid claim to the Kanza heritage, which is fine, but we also need to make sure that we know the story in its intimate detail as much as we possibly can. And the fact that you're here, I'd like to think is an indication that that interest is there. So anyway, now the darkest period deals with the Kanza story from 1847, which is when the tribe arrived at the Council Grove or Upper Neosho Reservation to take up their life in their villages. And then that went from 1847 to 1873. So I know that there have been people, experts, speaking about the Kanza to this group previously. I'm going to really skim over the early period of history of the tribe as we know it, and get to what I consider to be the central element of the story, and that has to do with the period of Euro-American encroachment on the Kanza reservation from 1857 to 1862. And I think in some ways that particular story, if we can look at that in some detail, encapsulates the larger arc of what happened to the Kanza during not only that 26-year period, but also their experience with Euro-Americans since the contact that began with the French in the late 17th century. So what we'll do is we're going to start in Washington, D.C., and we're going to set the stage with a meeting between Kanza chiefs and the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, a fellow by the name of John W. Denver, okay? And the chiefs were there to state their grievances about the fact that their reservation had been overrun by white squatters, okay? So we'll start there, and then we'll move back and take a look at the pre-reservation history of the tribe, Then we're going to take a quick look at some of the underlying core beliefs of the Euro-Americans at this particular time that shaped the way that they related to the Indians, both individually and collectively. Then I want to kind of skim over some of the events that took place early in the reservation. And I'm talking about the Council Grove Reservation history from 1847 to 1858. And then we're going to go back and resume a more detailed look at the encroachment that was taking place in 1858. So that's kind of the structure, and then I guess we'll have perhaps some time for some questions. So the Kanza chiefs, when they were meeting with John W. Denver, this is in July of 1857 in Washington, D.C., stated their grievances, and according to the official report, there was a catalog of the sufferings and apprehensions to which they have been subject in many and various ways at the hands of the whites who have trespassed upon their lands and wrested from their possessions and property and excluded them from the quiet and peaceful enjoyment thereof as guaranteed to them by solemn treaty stipulations. So this is these chiefs, Hardheart, Whitehair, and the Wolf, state the problem. We got white people living amongst us, okay? Is how that was translated. And Denver responds with a kind of a glib, stock government counsel to the tribes, and that is, go back to your reservation and pick up farming and live like white people. It's pretty much his response. Okay, all right, 8 months later, we're in March of 1858. A delegation of Kanzas chiefs appears in front of now the governor of Kansas Territory, John W. Denver. Okay? He's living in the Compton, which is the territorial capital in 1858. And the delegation, they're different chiefs, but they are complaining about the same situation, that the white people will run our reservation, and we're having difficulty in existence. This particular conversation produced a transformation in Denver's understanding of the conditions on the Kanza reservation. He now saw that his previous glib prescription that the Kanza should return to the reservation to farm like white men was an impossibility. Their reserve is covered all over with white settlers, Denver wrote to the Office of Indian Affairs, who will not allow them to plant their corn this spring. Okay, now let's leave this picture, but I wanted to just put that part of the story out there, right at the very beginning. We're going to leave this particular place and time, and we're going to take a look at how what happened to the tribe before they came to the reservation there in Council Grove in 1847. The Kanza were one of 5 Begihan people, tribes that spoke a southern Siouan language, the Quapaw, Ponca, Omaha, and Osage, and Kanza. And they were more than likely came from the Ohio River Valley. The 5 tribes, when they were one people, they split when they hit the St. Louis area. The Quapaw went downstream. The Omaha and Ponca went up the Missouri River. The Osage ended up in what is today southeast Missouri, southwest Missouri, southeast Kansas, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. The Kanza ended up, by 1700, they were in the present-day Kansas City area. And then by 1795, they had begun to establish a series of villages in Kansas River Valley, and by 1795, yes, they were at the Blue Earth Village here in near Manhattan, 3 or 4 miles to the east of here, and they were in one village when they were visited by a delegation from the Stephen Long expedition in 1819. In 1825, they split into 3 groups and established villages just west of where Topeka is located today. Then, of course, there was no Topeka. And actually, one of those 3 villages that was headed up by Hard Chief relocated to close to Bellevue or Wamego in the Vermilion River area in 1834. Okay, in 1825, the federal government established the first reservation for the tribe. Consisted of 6 million acres, extended on out to the headwaters of the Smoky Hill River in the west, 30 miles north and south, and went through the north central and western Kansas. Then in 1845, the federal government decided that, well, we really want to have the eastern 1/3 of this reservation for other tribes that come in and get settled. So we'll establish a new treaty, and we'll put the Kanza here on the eastern end of their what is a truncated reservation, and this would be like north of Salina, Minneapolis, Glasgow, in this area, if you're familiar with Kansas geography at all. The problem was that if the tribe, which at that point consisted of about 1,600 people, did establish villages here, they would be very much at the mercy of larger enemy tribes such as the Pawnee, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho, particularly the Cheyenne and the Arapaho since the 1820s had come into this area, north central Kansas, and more or less established this as their own buffalo hunting country. And the Pawnees had been here longer in central and eastern Nebraska, and they had also long since hunted buffalo and raided in this area, and they were larger tribes, hostile to the Kanza. It wasn't going to work, in other words, the way that the Treaty of 1845 prescribed in terms of the locating the new location for the Kanza. So, there was a provision in that treaty which said that if there's not sufficient hardwood timber in this area, they could relocate the tribe to a place where there was hardwood timber. Well, as a matter of fact, there was hardwood timber in that area, but the tribe didn't want to go out there, and the government really didn't want to build a fort and try to protect them there. So they looked around, and actually the tribe was at loose ends for a couple of years. In 1845 to 1847, they really didn't have their own reservation. And finally, in November of 1847, the government said, okay, let's establish a 20-mile square reservation here on the upper Neosho Valley, and this would be close to where Council Grove, located right there. Actually, not exactly in the middle, but close to the middle of that reservation. Okay, so the tribe did get established. They lived in 3 villages, 3, 7, and 10 miles downstream from Council Grove. There's a problem. The problem is you have the Santa Fe Trail or as they call it in those days, the Santa Fe Road, went right through the heart of that reservation. When the tribe was established here in 1847, you had the outbreak of the Mexican-American War in 1846, and that then caused a tremendous increase in the traffic, the freight especially, supplying the operations in the Southwest against the state of Mexico. The United States invaded Mexico and basically conquered one half of the Republic of Mexico. And this was the main line of supply, or a main line of supply, was the Santa Fe Road to those operations in the Southwest. So you have, Council Grove becomes a place where the government establishes a great deal of, blacksmith, repair shop. They decide in 1850 that they're going to build a new, they call mission, which is still standing in Council Grove. Most of you probably know that. The Methodists from the Shawnee Mission area come down to Council Grove and establish the building in the winter of 1850-51. It operates ineffectively for 3 years from 1851 to 54, and the government and the Southern Methodists decide that it's no longer feasible to try to continue operating it. The Methodists and the government officials basically blame the Indians for not being cooperative and interested in education. It's a little bit more complicated than that, and there's some real questions about just how serious the teacher was in terms of instructing his students. Some of the chiefs of the Kanza said that he really didn't teach people or our kids anything, that essentially he worked them on the farm, then he sold the produce from the farm and made profits for himself. Well, anyway, so that part didn't work. During that same period, in 1849, actually just the year before the commission was built, a cholera epidemic broke out on the Santa Fe Road. The 49ers headed out to the gold fields of California at that time, were victors of this disease, which was really lethal to the Kanza and other tribes. And of the 1,600 Kanza, they lost at least 100 people in the outbreak of cholera in the summer of 1849. When they initially got there, there were, in 1848, the government was supposed to break 100 acres along the Neosho River bottomland where the Kanza then could begin to farm. And the idea, of course, was that they were going to change the Kanza man from being these hunters and warriors, and they were going to turn them into farmers. All of the whole prescription of making white, educated, civilized farmers out of the Indians. Well, they could not, even though they brought several teams of oxen, there had been such a drought that had set in at that point that they literally could not break the ground in the bottom on the east side of the Neosho River, and they gave it up. Now, there's another thing that coincides with this, another layer of complexity that bears, I think, our awareness, and that is that from about 1650 to maybe earlier, maybe like 1600 to 1845, the climate in this area, in the Central Plains, had been fairly temperate, and it was humid. There was adequate moisture, and that was and the temperatures were cooler. It was actually termed the Little Ice Age. Well, About 1845, when the time that the Kanza arrived on this reservation, the Little Ice Age ends and a hot, dry period sets in. And so this whole conversion that they're trying to make in terms of changing the Kanza culture, which was naive, simplistic, and just wrong-headed, but they're going to make them into white Christian civilized farmers, that's another obstacle that takes place, is that the conditions are really not conducive to agriculture. As a matter of fact, one of the driest periods on record, drier than the 1930s, drier than the 1890s, drier than the 1950s, was the period between 1856 and 1864. It was an extremely dry period, particularly 1860 was just unbelievably dry. And so you had this compounding of these people that were suffering from all of these shocks that are taking place, and amplified by a climate that is not sympathetic to their being a productive agrarians, which is what the prescription was at the time. All right. You also had political problems. In 1854, Kansas becomes a territory. That opens the area for settlement, provided there's a survey, but that's pretty loose in terms of people going ahead and preempting land and ahead of where the surveys were had been conducted. So you have people of Euro-Americans beginning to settle in eastern Kansas. You have a whiskey trade that is thriving. You have at least 200 whiskey distilleries inside the Missouri border, and the Santa Fe Road becomes a pipeline for the whiskey trade. A lot of that whiskey is shipped down to the tribes. The tribes are some of the primary consumers of the whiskey trade. Another thing that happens here, there's a lot of horse thievery going on, and one of the things is happening is that a lot of the tribes are suffering from horse thieves who come onto the reservation, steal the Indian horses, and then the Santa Fe Road becomes kind of a road for moving the horse contraband out to the Colorado gold fields, which were discovered in 1858-59. So you have a multitude of problems taking place here. In 1855, there's a white trader moving up from the southwest. He brings smallpox to the Kanza reservation. In that summer alone, there were 400 Kanza who die of smallpox. Now, at that point, there were about 1,350 people in the tribe. And so you have about 30% of the population that's eliminated just in a matter of a few weeks. That's a crushing blow to these people, to the morale. It does usher in what one of the called chiefs, Ali Gawahu, described as his tribe's darkest period, hence the title of the book. All right. In 1855, the United States government appoints an agent for the Kanza, the first agent who was appointed expressly to represent the federal government and to administer the government policy vis-a-vis the Indian people, the Kanza people. His name is James Montgomery. Fine, it's about time they finally had an agent that actually showed up on the reservation. Before that, you had the agents were living in the Westport area. At one point, just to the west of Topeka, but they had multiple tribes that they had to administer to, and they're supposed to be looking after the tribal interests. They're supposed to be seeing that government policy is implemented, but at the same time, they're also supposed to be assisting the people, the tribe. James Montgomery is 21 years old. He's from Tennessee. The Indian agent position is a product of political patronage. Okay, his family, big Democratic family in Tennessee. So, their boy James leaves his home in Tennessee and comes out and deals with a mess. Okay? The mess being that, well, by the time he gets out here, white people are beginning to come on and settle onto the reservation that they are not supposed to be settling on. Now, what they say is, there are 4 different arguments that they use. One is we were misled by maps. All right, I've taken a real close look at this. We could get into this. Go ahead. This is what the primary map that was used by people who were settling in this area in the early territorial period. Here's the Kanza reservation here. There are some problems with this map. This is the Seth Eastman map, which is certified by the Commissioner of Indian Affairs on September 4th of 1854. There are some discrepancies in terms of, for instance, the Shawnee Reserve here is actually overlaps with the Kanza Reserve. Well, that was brought up. Well, it was confusing. The Shawnee, this showed that there was no overlap, so we were misled by the maps. The other thing they said was, well, the agent told us we could settle on the reservation. Well, the agent probably didn't really know. And I have a feeling, I can't prove this, I can't go to the documents to prove this, but some of the local leaders there in the Council Grove area, Thomas Huffaker, Seth Hayes, and George Simcock, and some of the merchants were probably taking this young guy and saying, well, yeah, it's okay to settle here. That reservation should be out here. Okay? And that's what they said repeatedly. That shows up in the newspapers of the period. Well, the reservation actually should be out here. Well, remember, that particular location was rejected ostensibly because it didn't have timber, but actually it couldn't have been administered at the time that they were trying to locate the Kanza. So, okay, so that's another problem that they had. The other thing is that Council Grove is starting to grow. The problem is that it's not a legal entity. They even go to the trouble of getting the Kansas Territorial Legislature in 1857 to issue them a charter saying you're an official town company and where you're located is okay. Well, that isn't going to square with the federal policy of this being an Indian reservation. So they have a problem. The government has a problem. Go ahead okay, the government has a problem. You got this burgeoning little town of Council Grove. You got the Santa Fe Road, and they're right here in the middle of the Kanza Indian Reservation. And then in 1857, there begins to be a real tidal wave of immigration into this area. This is considered Southwest Kansas, by the way, in 1857. And they begin to settle in this area, and they find that the reservation has some real desirable land. And so by 1858, you have anywhere from 250 to 800 settlers living illegally on the reservation. So in 1859, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, his name is Alfred Greenwood, he comes out to this area, he meets with the chiefs. Interestingly,
And this happens repeatedly. I could give all kinds of examples. The agent, James Montgomery, seems to be gone. He's not even there for this conference that they have with the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. He's absent an awful lot, as a matter of fact. They meet and they said, okay, we got this problem. You can't farm because these white squatters are swarming all over. Go ahead and advance it one more time. And so let's see. Go ahead one more. Okay, we are going to diminish your reserve down to a 9 by 14 diminished reserve. We'll put this will get Council Grove outside and the trail for the most part outside your reservation. This way we will ask. Yeah, thank you. Okay, the squatters here who have settled in this area, we will tell them to leave, and then they can settle on these trust lands. You will sell the trust lands, and that will give you the money to pay off your debts. The Kaw tribe had incurred, individually and collectively, a total of $36,500 in debt to principally 5 men who were merchants and entrepreneurs in Council Grove. Seth Hayes, George Simcock, Malcolm Kahn. These names aren't coming as easy as they used to when I was there in Council Grove. But anyway, there were 5 of them. Charles Columbia would be, Christopher Columbia, I should say. And then there was one more. But anyway, today if you go to Council Grove, you drive down 56 Highway, you're on the west side of the river, and then you turn right and go up one of the one of the streets there. The 5 streets that run parallel to 56 Highway are named after these 5 guys that had got the tremendous amount of indebtedness build up that the tribe owed them for provisions that they had provided them. Okay. Now, the government at this point, I'm going to speed this up a little bit because we're getting maybe a bit too detailed, but they also decided, well, we need to diminish the diminished reserve too. So we will eliminate the unallotted lands, and give every member of the tribe 40 acres. Okay, now there are 803 members of the tribe in 1860 when this treaty takes place. Okay, now the squatters are not happy with this treaty, and those who had settled before the reservation was surveyed in 1856, certified on December the 2nd, 1856, they demanded that because the government had confused them so much in their settling here, that the improvements that they made to their farms, their homes, on the reservation, that they be compensated. So the government says, okay, we can be, you will be compensated by monies that are going to be coming from the sale of the trust lands and unallotted lands. Now, let's be clear about this. That means that the Indians are paying these people who squatted illegally on their reservation. Okay? Gets worse. In 1862, there had been people living now on the diminished reserve, anywhere from 250 to 800, and they are demanding that they be compensated, even though an overwhelming majority of them had settled on those lands after December 2nd of 1856 and before the treaty was signed or ratified in 1859. So, and they're the people who are saying, Kanza, this isn't your land anymore, and don't try to farm it. because we're not going to allow you. Now, there's a guy by the name of Thomas Stanley. He's a Quaker. He's well-intentioned, idealistic, a good, solid Christian man. He settles down here, where close to the west of Americas. And his idea is, I will go on to the reservation and help the Indians learn how to farm. And that, and this is a decent thing to do. Well, he goes on to the reservation and he meets with the Indians and said, I'm here to help you learn how to farm. And then they tell him what's going on. And he then turns and writes to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs and says, I came here to help the Indians learn how to farm. There's no way that they can do this, that the white people will not allow them to do this. Well, all right, so the Indians then are finally coerced, actually it's a case of extortion, to have to agree to a treaty in 1862 where they agree to pay the squatters who settled on their diminished reserve, and they do in fact leave in 1862. But they come back, and they come back in 1867, 2 different times. They come back in 1869, they come back in 1870, they come back in 1871. The diminished reserve is overrun, and there's a whole story behind each and every one of those occasions. All right, that's I think good enough to explain the whole encroachment issue. Now, what's the underlying philosophy? What's the world view of these people that they feel like that they're entitled to do this? Well, okay, for one thing, the imperial ambitions of the United States. Okay, manifest destiny, the push west. We are providentially entitled to the land. We will make the land productive. We're farmers. The Indians are not farmers. Now, they were horticultural people. The women, for the most part, did raise the corn, beans, pumpkin, squash. But in terms of commercial farming, no, they weren't. We will transform this barren prairie, this wilderness, into a garden paradise. Okay? So, I mean, that was one of the justifications. The whole idea of progress. We're aligned with progress. We're the ones that are making things better. We're transforming the land and society through technology and science and the Christian religion. And so, of course, we're entitled to usurp the land, because that is our mission. There was a guy by the name of John Hopkins Clark who expressed this vision, this view, but I could have found 100 of similar statements. This guy is kind of an ordinary Kansas settler, and this is what he wrote in the 1850s. White people have taken upon ourselves the charge of this beautiful country. Clark spoke for all classes of Euro-Americans when he declared that Indians must submit to rule by whites. Manifest destiny, Clark wrote, is spreading the white race broadcast throughout the fair fields of the Great West, shedding the light of science and civilization, of religion, covering the dark, savage superstition of the native race in the grave of the past. In June of 1873, the 533 remaining Kanza full-bloods were removed to their new reservation in Indian Territory. For the settlers on the former Kanza reservation, their dreams of occupation had come to fruition. Paul Wallace Gates, author of 50 Million Acres, Conflicts Over Kanza Land Policy, said it best: disregard of Indian rights was traditional on the frontier, and it did no violation to settlers' ethics to intrude on Indian lands, whether trust, allotments, or reserves. So the Kanza, that whole part of the story is pretty complicated. But the Kanza, they tried to do 2 or 3 different times. They tried to sell the land, the surplus land, trust land, the unallotted land, and they failed. And there was so much. There were arguments about the assessments that preceded the sales. There was one of the sales seemed to be preempted by speculators, outside speculators who underbid the squatters. There was howls of protest over that. There was an assessment finally in 1873, the year that the Kanza were removed. There was assessment by their government agent at that point, he was a Quaker fellow by the name of Mahlon Stubbs, and he assessed it at the value of the land at about $650,000. Howls of protest went up among the people who squatted. No, way too high, way too high. And they boycotted a sale. So that, the government stepped in and said, okay, that is invalid. They brought a fellow by the name of Schuyler Jones in from Ohio to do an assessment, an impartial assessment. And he spent 2 weeks traveling over the reservation, and then he reported that, in fact, that Mahlon Stubbs' assessment was accurate. Well, that wasn't going to go anywhere either. That was the politically unpopular thing to say, and so they rejected that assessment. And the government then, later, about, I think it was 1876, 77, this is 3 years after the Kanza had been removed to Indian Territory, Thomas Sears Huffaker, who had been the teacher at the Call Mission from 1851 to 1854, did an assessment. And his assessment was about 30% lower than Mahlon Stubbs' assessment that had been done a few years before. And that was acceptable to the squatters, hence acceptable to the government. The Indians protested to no avail. They're now in what is today Kay County, Oklahoma. Okay, and so then they proceeded to have a sale. However, there was so much conflict in terms of the land claims that one of the observers, a fellow by the name of John Malloy, who was an editor of the Council Grove Democrat at the time, said that he doubted that there was a quarter section of this land that was sold in 1877 and 78 after the Huffaker assessment that wasn't legally contested, that didn't go into the courts. Okay? So these things were dragging out through the 1880s and into the 1890s in terms of who actually owned this land. Huffaker, for his contribution, was elected to the state legislature by his grateful constituency, both in 1874 and 1878. So, anyway, that's the rest of the story. Yes?
Somewhere in this time period, 77 to 79, Benjamin Singleton bought land for the freed slaves who came into that. Could you address that, where that happened?
Well, yeah, that you're talking about Dunlap,
Right.
in that area, and that's part of the. That would be located. Let's see what I do. Okay, that would be near Fulchis Village. This is Rock Creek here, and this area in here would be the Dunlap area, and the Singleton was a entrepreneur and interested in settling the black exodusters, and this is one of the places in Kansas. Kansas was considered more or less a promised land for the blacks after the Civil War and on into the 1870s. And so there was really a significant settlement in this area. Several hundred black people were settled into the area, and they seemed to thrive. There was, as late as the 1960s, 1970s, there's a fellow by the name of London Harness who was still living in that area. But over time, particularly in the 20th century, when things were really tough for farmers in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, there was considerable attrition, and the blacks moved out of that area.
We have Jim Sharp right behind me who wrote a book about it. It's called Reservation.
Oh.
And interviewed Linda.
Hi, Jim. Hi, sorry I didn't see you there. How you doing, sir?
Good.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, excellent book. You bet. Yeah, great. Yes?
I just want to know, what is the status of the remnants of the Kanza people today?
Okay. Well, actually, starting in the late 1870s, the tribe reorganized. It actually was from the 20s through the 60s, practically non-functional. By 1902, their reservation in Kate County, Oklahoma, was divided into land allotments. And I know when I visited with Wanda Stone, who was the chairperson of the tribe in the 1990s, I asked her, do you think that any of the Kanza people occupy or have that land, or any of the land that their ancestors were allotted in 1902? And she said, to the best of her knowledge, there was no one who did that. However, the tribe reorganized in the late 1870s and has actually, through the 90s and on into today, the tribal enrollment has grown considerably. You know, the last time I looked, and this has been a couple of years back, it seemed like there were 2,700 members in the tribe. It actually is. They have built a series of really viable complexes in the Call City, Newkirk area. They have really, those of you who travel I-35, the Rock and Brew casino there. They also have had for a while in Call City a kind of a quick shop place. They have a museum. They have an excellent Kanza language project. They provide all kinds of medical and social services for their people. They have been recognized by the federal government as a viable Indian tribe, and have qualified for all kinds of grants, and have really, even come back to this area, the Council Grove area especially, and they purchased 160 acres to the southeast of Council Grove, about 3.5 miles. It's the Aligawahu Park. Recently, the Prayer Rock was relocated from Lawrence to that area. There's a really nice facility for the Washunga Days powwow and other programs. They've done a great job of preserving the prairie, and have got some interpretive features in place there. So the tribe is back, and the tribe actually comes back every year for Washunga Days in Council Grove, and they also every 2 years, in September, the third weekend of September, they also produce a historical pageant called Voices of the Wind People, in which they co-sponsored that with the citizens at Council Grove. And that's been in operation since 1992, and it's been a really, I think, a very effective tool for
bringing the people together and to introduce the people of Kansas to the story of the Kanza in a dramatic form. So, I mean, there are other things that we could say. I mean, they've done a terrific job. There are no full-blooded Kanza left, however, but they've really done great work. Yeah. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
In your work and, you know, in reading other stuff about this, in the 1920s, there's a lot of conversation, or at least some, about the mission being the first segregated school in Kansas. And like you mentioned that briefly, it was something they brought up in the 1920s when they were trying to get the money to rebuild the mission. And so I was wondering, what do you know about, because I know that like the mission became a place for white settlers kids for a little while to go.
That's true.
So were they always separated? I mean, do you know anything about that, Ron, about how that,
well, my Huffaker, who was the teacher at the time, never weighed in on that specifically in terms of how that was set up. My impression was that there was a strict line between the Kanza students and the white students. Mm-hmm. And that Huffaker himself is pretty ambivalent about the whole business of the racial equality when it comes to his Council charges. And I'm not, I mean, he never obviously comes out and says anything overtly racist. But I always had the impression that he was more interested, this is somewhat conjectural, but that he was more interested in his entrepreneurial projects than he was in actually instructing the Kanza. I don't know if I'm really answering your question, Lisa. I don't know that there's a lot of specific documentation that's going to answer that question in terms of just how that was working. The one thing I do know is that after the school was closed for the Kanza in 1854, it continued to operate for the white children for an additional 2 years. And then in 1856, that too was closed down. Now, in terms of the schools, the Quakers established a school in 1863 that operated in 66. They were no more successful than the Methodists were from 51 to 54. But then again, they came back in 1869 and operated the school from 69 to 73 with some degree of success. But when we say success, we're talking about there was cooperation with the Council leadership and the full-bloods. The Quakers were very dedicated and honest in their approach to being an agent and teachers, with a major caveat being that the Indians had to become like white people, okay? They were not going to allow the Indians to be Indians. Now, we're talking about 1860s and early 1870s here, and it would be a radical notion to entertain the idea that the Indians should be Indians at that time. People just assume that this is, again, that ideal of progress and the superiority of white Christian civilization, that you've got to make them like us because that's good for them. And that was axiomatic. Yes?
Question was, did the tribal people willingly have their children go to these schools, or were these children taken to those schools?
Yeah. Okay. What the evidence suggests is that, see if I can remember the wording, that the dependents and orphans of the Kanza were the ones that they sent to the school. And one of the things that the Indians complained about was that when the students came back from the school, that they were misbehaved and were in some ways, I think Hardchief said, well, after they smelled the big knife, they really weren't very good Indians anymore. I mean, that there was a real sense that turning their children over to the teachers was bad for the tribe and bad for the kids themselves. Now, in the first Quaker school from 63 to 66, the agent Farnsworth met with the tribal leadership to try to find out why things weren't going well. And basically, the Indians complained that the Quakers weren't very good teachers. They complained about their methodologies. The Quakers, for their part, complained that, well, we feel like we're making progress, and then there's a buffalo hunt, and all our students join up with the hunt and go out to central Kansas, and everything that we felt like we were accomplishing was taken away from us. So that would be the conflict. Even so, from 63 to 66, it does not appear the mixed bloods are sending their kids to school. Okay? But it doesn't appear that the traditional full-blooded leaders like Aligawahu and Wabianga and some of the others are sending their kids to school, according to the rolls. That does change. From about 1871 to 73, Aligawahu, who's nominally anyway the head chief of the Kanza, sends his kids to the school. And it does appear that some of the more influential full-bloods have come around to the point where they are sending their kids to school, including girls. Before, there would be maybe 3 or 4 girls and 25 boys, and toward the end, I think there was many as 10, 11, 12 girls and 20 boys or so. So that's kind of in terms of what the documents show us, that's pretty much what I can say about it. I don't know if that answers your question. Did you have anything else along those lines?
Well, you mentioned that, at the end, Ali Gamoahu, I forget the title of the chief, sent his children. It was more like out of resolve that we probably need to do this because things have changed enough for us that we're not going to be who we are anymore. And so that is later during this time frame, and I know there were many other schools set up all the way to the east to Carlisle and so on.
Right.
But were there protests ever by the tribal people because of the methodology or the techniques used by the schools to educate their children?
Yeah, there definitely was during the Methodist period. One of the chiefs, I'm trying to remember who it was, met with the agent and said that Huffaker doesn't teach our children anything. He just works them on the farm, and then he sells the produce, and our kids don't learn. And the first Quaker administered school, there were complaints by elders that the methodologies were boring and that the students weren't really learning because of methodologies insufficient and non-stimulating. I didn't see anything like that in the reports between 69 and 73. I think you're absolutely right. One way of putting this is that the only apparent way out of the darkness was that you began to embrace the schooling that the white people are offering. As a matter of fact, this is really revealing when they one of the reasons that the Kanza agreed to go to Oklahoma with the Call Land Bill of 1872 was that they were guaranteed there would be a school in place when they got there. And that was one of the leverage points where they concurred with that. Well, the government didn't fulfill that. And there were reports by the agent where he was being beseeched by Kanza children, and this is in Oklahoma now, asking for their school. So there had been a shift. There had been a shift, and that there was a sense that this was, this might be our only option here for something better. Yes.
So were there forced residential schools there?
Yeah, they lived, these were boarding schools. Yeah.
And then with the Quakers, people probably complained because the Quakers would not get the children, not severe discipline.
I didn't run across any references specifically to those schools and the Quakers. I know that certainly the Methodists would not have any compunctions about using the rod, as they said. But in terms of the Quaker, there are a couple of instances where the Quakers say that actually they found their Kansas students to be very compliant and very good-natured. And so I don't know that that was really a strong consideration for them. But I do know that certainly the Shawnee Mission schools were very much, the Shawnee Mission being the parent institution to the Call Mission, administered by the Methodist Episcopal Church South. But they definitely had discipline issues, and that corporal punishment was just a way of functioning. Yeah.
The Calls were on the reservation at Dunlap, Council Grove in 1861 through during the Civil War, 61 to 65.
Yeah.
Were they required, or did they serve in the United States Army or the service during that time?
Okay, that's a great question. Actually, the Calls initially went to the government and said, hey, we would like to volunteer. And the initial response was, no, we're not going to do this. But by 1863, the government was amenable to that. And the Calls, I think there were over 80 Calls that ended up volunteering for Company L of the 9th Kansas Cavalry. Those 80 plus, I think there were like 19 deaths, most of which was due to disease. But that the reports of the commanding officers were very positive about their making very good soldiers, and that they were served mostly in Arkansas, and that they were engaged in several firefights, and that they had acquitted themselves very well. Yeah. Sorry.
I appreciated your mentioning the ideology of domination, including manifest destiny and the idea of progress, and I wondered a couple of things about it. One was whether there was an explicit incorporation of utilitarianism as a part of that ideology, Another was whether there were phases, whether this was a period, I don't know when manifest destiny was first used as a concept, but were there phases in this ideology of domination?
Wow. Okay, the first question about utilitarianism.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this really interests me. Actually, I'd love to read you a passage from my book that gets into this whole thing. The whole idea that the landscape had to be rationalized. And so Thomas Jefferson's grid, geometric, well, the township, section lines, surveying, the whole thing then was turned into this very linear, rational, the landscape and all its complexity and all of its uniqueness and from the Kanzas point of view, a spiritual dimension wiped out. How can we make this efficient to administer it so that we could have productive industrial economy and we'll be able to taxation and land acquisition and all these things will be facilitated by a linear kind of a model imposed over what is a very dynamic, unique landscape that I think transcends that. But that's what we have when you drive out there in the country. I mean, you're going to be following section lines because the grid has its grip on us, and it's still justified. I mean, in terms of one of the talks I gave 5 or 6 years ago, one of the legislators took me to task for well, you're criticizing this. This is what really makes sense. This is the best way to do it. Well, the Kanza had a system that worked pretty well, before we came along and improved it through utilitarian application. Okay, so the second one is a really big question. Okay, you want to repeat the second part of your question?
I wondered whether there was an earlier period, for instance, in which there was some restriction of evangelical conversion of Indians into Christianity, or whether there was an earlier period in which utilitarianism was not such a strong, because what I was reminded of was that in India there was, before the 1830s, there was much more respect for Indian traditions by the British imperial authorities. But in the 1830s, utilitarianism and evangelicalism came in as very strong efforts to convert the society.
I think that the answer there would be, as long as the tribes could mount military opposition, then there would be a reluctance to impose this kind of systematic control in terms of rationalizing everything. I don't know that there ever was any real deep respect, right? Much respect at all for Indian ways, the Indian worldview, the Indian, the native point of view, but there had to be a kind of grudging acknowledgement that you had to operate in a diplomatic way with these people. Actually, in a microcosmic situation, in terms of the Kanza on the reservation, in the Neosho reservation, there was a concern about the possibility of Indian uprising, the Kanza uprising, and that there was a kind of finessing around that possibility.
that changed after an event took place in 1859 where there was a confrontation on Main Street between Seth Hayes, the merchant, and some of the white people and Kanza leaders who had come in to protest the impending arrest of a couple of people, a couple of their tribesmen that were accused of stealing horses. So there was shots fired, a couple of white people were hurt. Well, the white people dedicated themselves at the beginning of that incident that we're going to exterminate the tribe. And that had been precipitated a year before in August 1858 where the whites had met with the Kanza and said, if you hurt any more white people, we're exterminating you. Okay? Well, then that led to negotiations and finally they hung 2 young men right there on Main Street. But after that, there was no pretense of having to really honor agreements. I mean, the Treaty of 1846 had guaranteed the Kanza this land forever. I mean, that's right there in the language of the treaty. It's almost like stereotypical, you know. Well, it's there. The phrasing is there. And, well, I mean, that obviously was expendable, and you didn't have to worry about it.
This sounds like a topic that can go on forever.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Yes.